So I'm Bob Baker. I'm Chief Technology Architect for Clark, and I've been here about 7 months. And my background is 31 years in the broadcast business. So anyway, so I worked where we did 88 networks all over the world, brought in 40,000 feeds from all over the world, and so I have a lot of experience in television. And today, what I want to do is talk to you about SDI versus SMPTE 2110. So why would you choose SMPTE 2110 as an IP solution, or why would you stay with SDI? So first thing we're going to do is talk about the history. So let's go back to SDI history. In 1989, we started with standard def, and it was 270 megabits per second. And this is where we went from good old analog video to SDI, which was a serial digital interface. And the great thing about it was, right, is that as long as you kept within the specs of the equipment and the cable runs, right, you had a perfect signal. It never degraded. So anyway, so it was so great going to a digital video interface and be able to just screw a BNC on and boom, just a picture came up and worked. In 1998, then high definition came out. And there was a couple big things that happened with high definition. One was not only is it a much higher bit rate at 1.5 gigabits per second, so you can imagine, you know, all the equipment, the cameras, the switchers, the routers, the patch panels, everything had to be able to handle 1.5 gigabits. So that was a big step up. But there was something bigger, if you remember, that happened with high definition, and that was the aspect ratio. So this was a big problem for when I was at the network, right? Because you went from a 4x3 raster to a 16:9. Do you upconvert with panels on the side? Do you stretch it? Do you crop it? Do you do letterbox when you downconvert? There was all these issues we had to deal with going between aspect ratios. So anyway, so that was something we all had to deal with. Then in 2006, what happened is back with HD is you either went with 720p or 1080i, right? It was kind of like the Mac versus PC argument. And so anyway, so at the network, we chose 1080i because we wanted what I call full HD resolution, 1920 by 1080 pixels. But other people, like Fox and people doing sports, chose 720p because they wanted the progressive look. So anyway, so that was a big thing. You either choose one or the other. So, but one thing everyone agreed on, and that was that we all would like to have full HD resolution, but be progressive. So that's where in 2006, we wrote the standard that does what we call 3G, so which is 3 gigabits per second. So now we've gone even double the bit rate again of what we can do through cable and patch panels and everything. So let's do a quick review of our resolution chart. So you notice in the bottom corner down here, we have standard def, we have then 720p, we have then 1080p or 1080i, and then the film guys, they have to be a little different, so they got 2K because they had different imagers, DSLRs, all that stuff came out, and so they started with different sizes. Then 4K came out, and so which we call ultra high definition. Notice that UHD is used at 4K and 8K. Some people get that confused, so just remember that. Make sure you know which one you're dealing with. But basically, we dealt with, now we are at 3840 by 2160. And here again, the film guys, jumped up to 4096. And then we had Red came out with a 5K camera, and then people came out with a 6K camera, and then we started doing 8K. As you know, the Japanese have been working on 8K for a long time with NHK. They said they were going to start doing some of the Olympics this year, by the way, in 8K. Of course, you know that got postponed until next year. So anyway, just give kind of a review of all these different resolutions and standards that we have. So one thing I want to mention here is that we're talking about resolutions right now, not frame rates. So when we talk about bit rates and we talk about IP, remember, you got to know the resolution and the frame rate, right? Are you 23? Are you 24, like film? Are you 25, Europe? Are you 50? Are you 59.94? Are you 60? All these different standards that you got to know which one are you running. So now let's look at the last slide on history. In 2007, SMPTE, the standards group, came up with 2022-1, 2, 3, and 4, which was MPEG-2 transport streams over IP. And we've been doing that for a long time. And then in 2012, this is the big one, and that is they created 2022-6. So this is where we took SDI video and we did nothing but encapsulate it in IP, okay? And it works. It works really well. The networks have been using this for a long time. We do it over the country. We do it all over the place, and it works really well. There's only one problem with this we'll talk about later, and that is that you can't break apart the signal. So you can't say I want video from here and audio from here. We'll talk about that in a minute. So in 2013, they come up with -5, which was the forward error correction, and then in 2013, we go back to 2013, we had -7, which is the seamless protection switching. And we'll talk about that later, but basically the idea is you can have 2 streams and you can switch between them seamlessly. It's just like a switcher. It's a perfectly like a clean switch router. And so it works really well. We'll talk about that later with SMPTE 2110. What happened next was everybody realized that this was a problem because you can't break apart the signals. And so basically the idea was that it was great for long haul transport, but wasn't good for studios. So Evertz in 2015 said, we're going to fix the problem. So they developed a new recommended practice, not a standard recommended practice, that said we can take SDI, turn it into an MPEG transport stream, and therefore you can break apart the video and audio and data, okay? And so they called it Aspen. And at NAB, everyone showed up at NAB and they said, we have the answer to everything, it's Aspen. And all the other vendors went, whoa, time out, hold on a minute. We weren't part of this standard, we weren't part of this. So at the end of NAB, they formed an alliance group called AIMS, and they all got together and said, let's all standardize on one standard and come up with where we all agree on one thing, and we're gonna call it something, which ended up becoming 2110. Okay, what happened was in 2015, later then, they realized that the VSF group, which is the Video Services Forum, had already started to write a standard recommended practice to become a standard to be able to break apart video and audio. And so the SMPTE guys were like, this is awesome. They've already done a bunch of the work for us. So that really helped them to move this forward quicker. And so then they started building it, testing it, and then in 2017, they finished the main part of the standard, which was SMPTE 2110. So I put this slide in there. Everyone kind of says, everyone has to have an eye chart. This is my friend Wes Simpson wrote this, who's with Telecom Product Consulting. And basically the point of the slide is to show you that on the left side is all the compressed standards and on the right side is all the uncompressed standards. And I did this because I really want you to understand how complicated this is. There's a lot to all these standards and everything, right? So this is a whole lot different than SDI, right, where you just put a BNC connector and it works. And so anyway, so all this has been coming together over years and years and years in order for this to work over IP. Okay, now let's talk about SDI versus 2110. So in SDI, we had video, we had embedded audio, 16 channels, and then we have ancillary data, which could be like closed captioning. In 2110, each essence is a separate stream. Each essence is time-stamped, which is really important for lip sync, right, and things like that. And users can ask for what they want. So an example is I can now say, I want video from this camera, but I want audio from this digicode board, okay? Or I want data from my closed caption inserter. You can pick and choose anything you want and create your new stream. So this is really, really cool, and this is the big reason why we did this. Okay, so this is a slide I found online that a lot of vendors use that just gives an overall view of kind of how we went from SDI with 2022-6, and then how we added then in the AS67 for audio, and how we then worked our way over to what became 2110. The main reason why I put the slide in here was because I want you to understand something. At the bottom, you notice it says timing, and that's important. And so we have this thing called PTP, Precision Time Protocol, and that's something we'll talk about later, but that's really important to keep everything timed up together, because in SDI, it was all in the same cable. Okay, so now we're going to talk about each individual standard, which is dashes from -10 up to 40. And these are, by the way, we're still adding more to these. So -10 is system timing, -20 is uncompressed video, -21 is wide, narrow, burst, and smooth, -22 is compressed video. By the way, this was just added last year, and it's because there were some people that said, we really like the way 2110 works, but we have to compress our video. We can't do uncompressed. We don't have enough bandwidth. And so that, like an example is JPEG XS, which is new for 4K. So next is -30, which is PCM audio, which we chose AES67. And then -31 is the AES transparent transport, which I'll talk about that later. And then -40 is the ancillary data. So now let's just step through each one. So -10 is system timing. The main thing, remember here is that we use PTP as this timing stamp, so we can keep everything in time. -20 is uncompressed video. One thing that's really important here is to understand we only send the active picture. So let me explain. In SDI, there was a bunch of data on the left side of the screen called the hank, and a bunch of data on the top side of the screen, which is called the vank. And that's sent separately now, so we don't need to have that anymore in there. So we only send the active picture, and that saves bandwidth. So we also support up to 32K by 32K. I don't know about you, but we just started doing 4K, and Japanese are starting to do 8K, and this is supporting up to 32K. So I think that would be an incredibly huge amount of bandwidth in order to do that. So I think we're good on that. So we support all the different samplings, 422, 424, 444, 422, and all that, and bit rates. And then also we support HDR, high dynamic range. Okay, dash 21 is what I call the messy one. Then the reason why is because what we found is when they were writing the standard is that if you have a broadcast piece of equipment, like say a Grass Valley or Evertz or Imagine, Cobalt, whatever, it's going to be really it's going to be a tight IP stream, what we would call smooth, okay? Video never stops, so it's not like the internet where you say like HLS with cell phones where you're bursting and bursting and bursting to your cell phone. So anyways, so it's going to be narrow, what we call narrow, it's going to be smooth. The problem comes in is if you say you took a Mac computer and you're going to run Adobe Premiere and you said, oh my gosh, I don't have time, I need to play this spot back to the network right now and come out of my Mac. Well, if you're doing SMPTE 2110, chances are, out of the Mac, it's going to be bursty, okay? It's not going to be smooth. So here's where it comes in. If you have a narrow transmitter and a narrow receiver, you're fine. If you have a narrow transmitter and a wide receiver, you're fine. If you have a wide transmitter, like it coming out of, say, a Mac, and you're going to a narrow receiver, it's not going to work. So this is the problem. So you have to decide when you purchase your gear whether it's going to be wide or narrow, what mode you're going to run it in. Once again, let's say you bought a Grass Valley system that was complete end-to-end, their solution. It's not going to be a problem because everything's going to be narrow and tight like all the big broadcasters are and networks are. One last thing I got to mention on this is that if it's wide, that means you're going to have a buffer, which takes memory, which means it costs more money, and there's latency. And I don't know about you, but I hate latency. So we've all seen the news shot where they ask the question about the plane and they just kind of stand there for 2 seconds before they answer. I don't know about you, but I can't stand when I see a pastor preaching with his arm up and it comes down and a second later his arm comes down on the screen. So anyway, so we need to be really concerned about that as far as latency in a system. Okay, dash 30 is audio. As you know, we chose AES67. It was already done. It was already written. They just stamped it and put it in and 48 kilohertz sampling. So it was pretty easy one to do. It worked really well. There's one problem you need to know about with AES67, and that is that it doesn't support compression. So if you're compressing audio like the networks do with Dolby E, Dolby AC3, say AAC, Pulse, whatever it is, it won't work. So anyway, so you have to be AES67 compliant. It's not going to work. So in order to fix that problem, they created a dash 31. And so that's why we call it AES.3 transparent transport. So AES.3 typically is 3 megabits per pair of audio. So people can embed data into that audio stream. So let me give you an example. At a previous network I was at, we could actually say embed tally information in the SDI, send it to New York, and tally the cameras because the show was being switched from Atlanta. Or say, for instance, you're doing digital ad insertion, digital Q tones, maybe tally, like the tally time code, all these data things that you want to do, contact closures that you embedded, this will support that. And then also now it's going to support the digital compressed audio. So that was a good thing. Okay, then lastly is dash 40, which is ancillary data. We have closed captioning, digital ad insertion, things like that. Here's a little drawing. I won't go through it all. It just kind of just shows how you could take the different streams, build them all together through a network. If you want to go back, if you need to go from SDI to SDI, whatever, and you can be added in your captioner for closed captioning. So it's kind of cool. So next we're going to talk about PTP. This is a little bit tough because it's one of the most challenging things that these networks have had in building these systems. And basically we have to time everything together. So with this standard, we can use this clock reference to do this. You can think of it like NTP on your computer where you lock to your time, for keep your time accurate. But it's much, much more accurate. So basically it uses what's called an epic date and time. And the way it works is it goes all the way back to 1970, January 1st at midnight, 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. And by using that reference, they can get an extremely accurate timing and everything. And so this has actually been used. There's an IEEE standard that's been used for a long time, but basically now they're using it for SMPTE 2110. So anyway, so you can have a grandmaster clock if you had a big system, like a big network, or you can have just a simple master clock. You can even use switches as a clock, and then you can have slave clocks. So it gets complicated. Like I said, It's been one of the more challenging things that these networks and the vendors have been building these systems to deal with. It'll continue to get easier and better over time. Okay, now let's talk about switches. So now we've gone through the standard. Now we'll talk about actual IP switches. So how do we switch all this through all the gear? Because it's IP. To me, there's two different types of switches. There's COT switches, which are the commercial off-the-shelf switches, like Cisco, Arista, Mellanox, and Juniper. Okay. Then there's Evertz. And the reason why I say that is because Evertz built their own IP switch. I'll show you a picture later. It's big, it's massive, it's heavy, it takes a lot of power, but they decided to build their own switch. They feel like these other companies don't know how to do video, and they know how to do video over IP really well. Whereas the other companies like Grass Valley, Nevion, Imagine, people like that, they said, no, we're going to work with these vendors, and we're going to make 2110 work through the switches. And that's what they've done. So you kind of choose which way you want to go. One last thing I got to say about this is when I say commercial off the shelf, okay, it doesn't actually mean that you can go on Amazon and buy a Cisco switch and it'll work with 2110 because there's a lot of things that have to be perfectly set and adjusted for the multicast in order to work. So anyway, so even though we say that, if you're going to go and order, what's really popular today is Arista. If you went to order an Arista switch, you would want to tell them before you place the order, I need a SMPTE 2110 compliant switch. And they would know, okay, we know that's this model that's a -2110, okay? So that way we know it's been set up and proven for 2110. So that's something just to think about. Okay, now let's talk about redundancy. So redundancy, you have to decide whether or not you want redundancy not in your system. What does that mean? Well, today, if you have an SDI switch in your church or in a broadcast facility, most of us only have one, right? Because they're very expensive, but they're really reliable. So anyway, so basically, we choose that. When it went to IP with 2110, a lot of the networks said, right, I don't trust running the Super Bowl through a Cisco switch, you know what I mean, or Mellanox. But they're saying, okay, we have to have redundancy. We have to have man backup. So this goes all the way back to my slide at the beginning was there's this SMPTE standard called -7, right, which handles hitless switching. So we can have two switches, two streams coming through the whole system all the way through. And then it'll switch seamlessly between them. And by the way, I mean, it's like a clean switch router. And Evertz, they call it packet merge. So anyway, what does that mean? That means you have to have two outputs from every device. So every camera, every switcher, every source that you have, whether it's ProPresenter, whatever it's going to be, you have to have two outputs to feed your switches, and you have to have two inputs to everything. So for your router, for whatever it is you're feeding, even monitors. So for instance, AJA, by the way, came out with a SMPTE 2110 to HDMI converter 2 years ago at NAB, and we were all like, yes, this is great, it's cheaper than the other vendors, and we could use this. And then we realized, well, we're doing hitless switching at the network I was at, and it only had one Ethernet port. So we told AJA, it's not going to work. We have to have two. You have to switch between them. And guess what? Next year at NAB, they had a 2-input switch now that converts to HDMI. So anyway, so that's something you have to realize and decide, whether or not you want to pay the money for that redundancy. So one thing 2110 doesn't handle is discovery and registration. So it's a transport system. We get from point A to point B and we connect it. But the thing is that we need to discover the devices, we need to manage IP addresses, we need to register it, and we need to be able to handle all this traffic, and by the way, bandwidth. So anyway, so AMWA, which is a standards group, they went ahead and came up with this NMOS standard that is ISs, which is interface specifications. So ISO 4 is discovery and registration, ISO 5 is device connection management, and then network management, and then ISO 8 is audio mapping. And basically what this is with AES 67 in 2110, there were some complaints about how we handle mono and stereo and how we break apart the audios. So they decided to add that in as audio mapping. So what's happened is that they've went out to all the vendors saying, you all need to come in and work with us on this standard so we all agree on how we do this. So one of the companies that I got a picture here, one of the companies that has been really involved with this is Nevion. And so they created a JTNM, Joint Task Force group, that says we're all going to agree on this together and work together on this. Okay, so what happened is that they meet before big shows like NAB and IBC at Fox in Houston at Woodlands, and they basically decide, work together and make sure everything connects properly. So if you join this and you show up for the interopt at this test, then you were given these red and green stickers to say that you passed the test. And what does that mean? You now can put this in your booth at NAB. So basically last year at NAB, if you walked around, you would have seen devices with these red and green stickers there, because that was saying that they're part of that group and they're part of that team, and they were there for the testing, and they were approved. Okay, so now let's talk about bandwidth for a minute, do a little refresher before we go into the drawing and talk kind of about how a system would look. So in standard def, we had 270 megabits per second. In HD, 1.5 gigabits per second. And then we did the 1080p thing, right? So we were at 3 gigabits per second. And then in 4K, now we're starting to do 4K at 12 gigabits per second. So if I'm doing over fiber between these switches, okay, I got to decide how much can I fit into those fiber optic transmitters, okay? So if you had a 10 gig transmitter, I can get 6 HDs or 3 gigs. If I'm doing 4K, doesn't fit. So if I go to 25 gig, I can do 16, 8, or 2 4Ks. So I can do 2 4Ks at 12 gigabits each in a 25 gig laser transmitter. And then if you have you want to spend more money, you can go to 100 gigs and you can get a whole bunch of signals into there. So the way this works is that originally people were starting out with all 10 gig devices, 10 gig interfaces, but then they realized 12 gig doesn't fit for 4K, so they went to up to 100 gigs, and now there's a lot of companies are doing 25 gigs now. So anyway, so it just kind of depends on what money you want to spend and how you want to interface your devices. So let's look at a drawing now, and you kind of see how it works. So this is a drawing that we did for a church, a design drawing with Grass Valley. And so this is real. This is one of the designs if you're using COT switches. And so basically, if you see at the top here, there are 2 what we call spine switches, and then across there is the leaf switches. So basically, the leaves talk to the spine, and the spines are doing all the switching and control, decide where everything goes. Also, you can see there's even they show a little, satellite dish, a little GPS receiver for PTP, the way they do PTP. Anyways, and then at the top, you'll notice there's different control systems. And then at the bottom, what you see here is different parts of the church. So you have your main auditorium, you have your theater, your chapel, and then your main control room, okay, or some people call it broadcast and core. And so you see the nice Cayenne switcher there, which is the huge switcher. You'll notice, by the way, in there it says like 192 inputs and 96 outputs. So that's a lot of videos going in and out of there. And by the way, you can see it's only a few fibers. So anyway, so you can see the difference of SDI versus IP here is we just connect up a few fibers and we can send a lot of signals back and forth between them. So next thing is typically people are now running 100 gigs between the leaf and the spines. So you'll notice those red lines. So that's where we're running 100 gig fiber optics between those two. Now, what you have to basically do then is that 2 things. One is, right, you got to pick your switch. So in this situation, say we had actually a 48 port switch up top and maybe 64 port switches down below. So you decide maybe there's a small kids room, and in that case, we're going to put in a 12 or 24 port type switch. So you kind of decide on how much you need, and then basically you connect them all up with fiber. So the next thing you have to be really concerned about is bandwidth. So we have to decide, what is the maximum number of signals are going to be going through these switches at one time, and can the switch handle that? And so that's something that, and of course, Grass Valley did that for us on these switches. So they calculated all that. They came back, reported back to us and said, here's what you can do, and here's what we recommend for switches. And obviously, by the way, you say, hey, I want to add, of course, if you want to add a couple cameras, not an issue at all, right? Because there's lots of ports in these switches. You just plug it in, because I can do 6 cameras, by the way, on one 10 gig interface. And a lot of people are doing 25 gigs. So it would take a lot. You'd have to add a lot of things in order to finally fill these switches up. And if you did fill it up, then you could just add more switches. Okay, so now I'll give you an example of Evertz doing their EXE switch. You can see the picture on the left versus the COT switching over on the right, where we have 2 switches. This was a Grass Valley installation for a network where we have all the fibers coming in and out, and you can see how many ports there is, room to grow. And then what they did was they put switches in other parts of the facility, right? So if you had a whole bunch of cameras in one area, you could just put a switch there and connect all those cameras up to that switch. That's why the spine leaf works really nice. On the left side, you have Evertz. This switch is actually, like I said, a whole rack. It is 47 terabits per second, which is just an insane, incredible amount of bandwidth. It can support 13,000 by 13,000 cross points. I had a 512 by 512 at the network I was at. They had a 1024 by 1024 in another building, and a lot of churches have 100, 200 or something like that. So this is a huge switch. That handles a lot of videos going through it. And by the way, when it's fully populated, it's 95 decibels loud. So a lot of people are, some of the networks I know are putting them in separate rooms actually because they're so noisy. And they actually draw a lot of power. So anyway, so this is a kind of example of two different ways of doing it, how you want to lay it out. By the way, Evertz does make smaller modules, of course, too. Okay, and then last thing here is that this was from IBC last fall in Amsterdam, and I was there and I walked down and all of a sudden I turned and there was an NEP truck, and I soon learned that it was a complete SMPTE 2110 truck. So they actually had one last year at NAB in Vegas, and now this was NEP's truck that they keep in Europe. So you can see the truck on the top right, you can see the control room down there in the bottom right, looks just like any other control room, and then on the left, this is one of the rows of racks. There's a couple racks that have more IP switches in them. But the one thing I thought was interesting is you notice the empty blank panels. I've done a lot of remotes, and I can tell you very seldom see any blank panels in a TV truck because there's so much gear in that truck that has to go down the road at 80,000 pounds, and they're just crammed with equipment. And this is because it's IP. So there's a lot less gear. You can put a lot over fiber from the cameras, the switcher, and everything else than you can. So kind of circling back to in the church, right? The question is, why would I choose IP over SDI? And it really depends on what you're doing, right? If you have a large SDI plant, okay, right, and you want to add a couple cameras, or let's say you're adding a theater and you're going to put 6 cameras in there, then probably you don't want to do 2110. Right? Because you have a big working SDI system and you just add to that. But if you're going to do a new build and you're going to build a new church, a new campus, whatever, then you really want to consider this because it's so much more efficient, it takes so much less room, and there's just so many advantages once you get into multicasting with switches where you can just send things anywhere and it just works really, really well. So anyway, so it just kind of depends. You got to kind of ask yourself. One more thing I was mentioning earlier is that, if you have a lot of SDI today, you have to buy converters, and they cost money. So anyway, so that's something you got to look at is that how much am I converting to IP and how much am I converting back to SDI to feed things like projectors and things like that and LED walls. So you got to decide. Real quick, and as far as vendors go, there's companies like obviously Evertz has a ton of SMPTE 2110. There's Grass Valley and Nevion and Imagine, all these big broadcast type vendor companies that are doing all this. As far as Ross goes, they now have their Ultrix router supports SMPTE 2110 that just came out a few months ago, but the switchers are still SDI. When you get into 4A, they have some new equipment coming out that will do 2110, but the switchers that we all know that we love today, they're still SDI. So there's some vendors like that where some stuff is still SDI today, but they're slowly starting to pick this up and starting to come out with SD 2110 standards on their equipment. So thank you for watching. There's my name and email and cell phone number, and we have a live chat going on right now, and so you can continue to put in your questions and I will answer them. Thank you for watching.